So the chat today will be in two parts. We'll first, so Jan and myself will be hosting the chat, and we have a few questions, and we're both going to kind of try and bring out the book to you through our questions and through Scott. So first part we'll be chatting with Scott and asking a few questions. And what is important to us is that if at any point anyone wants to jump in and ask a question, all you have to do is write a question in the chat, or just say I have a question, or raise your hand. And then if you're too shy, then we can just read out the question, or you could yourself ask the question, which would be great. Okay, so just very, very quickly, I'm Jonathan Edwards. I'm the organizer of the Geneva Jobs to be Done group. And I'm not in any way a consultant in Jobs to be Done. I had a company for 7 years, was a freelance for 7 years, and got very interested in questions around innovation and entrepreneurship. And that's how I got onto Jobs to be Done, and got very interested in the topic and read all sorts of books. And I would probably say most of the literature, although probably not everything. And that's it. That's it for me. And Jan, do you want to present yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jan Wermuth. I, on the other hand, am partner in a small consultancy here in Zurich. We're Eventbridge Growth Architects. And for us, kind of Jobs to be Done has always been like one of the key inspirations in what we do, and one of the leading ways of thinking about our work and how we help companies innovate. I think pretty early on, Beat Walter is also in the calls. He has kind of picked up this methodology, and we can debate what it actually is later on. Quite some time ago, I came across Jobs to be Done some 10, 11 years ago, and it kind of immediately made sense. And the more you kind of dig into it, the more you actually discover how much is hidden behind the more or less, let's say, superfluous quotes. I mean, everybody gets the quotes, but then all of a sudden, a whole world opens up of complexity and amazing discussions in the Jobs to be Done community, which kind of helped, keeping my interest for whatever Jobs to be Done is, and we can debate this later on over the past 10 years. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to mention one little thing as well, and which is why I love to be talking about Scott's book. And thank you very much for being here. So Scott, you're claiming yourself that you are a Jobs to be Done philosopher, and I love this about you because I have a background in philosophy. So immediately when I read the book on the first few lines, I knew, okay, this is a book for me. And sometimes there are those cases where you think, okay, I think I've come across a book I should have written, or I wanted to have written, and that was kind of the case with your book. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for me also. And I also have to say, I really love this book. And as I said, I've read quite a few of the Jobs to be Done literature. And this is a book that when you read often a lot of Jobs to be Done books, you start getting lots of deep questions and like, but what does it mean? You know, what's a problem? What's a solution? All these kinds of things. And what I really liked is you really address these questions and you don't shy away from them. You really dig right in. And I thought that was great. You're very precise on your definitions, and I really enjoyed that. So I love the book, and so that's why we're also having this talk today. So I'll just introduce Scott quickly. I can't look at the camera because I've got a little text here. So Scott is a Jobs to be Done philosopher and practitioner. He has a diverse background from manufacturing to product management and corporate innovation leadership. He was director of Strategin Institute, the educational arm of Tony Ulwick's firm. So I guess you all know him. Strategin and Tony Ulwick developed the ODI, Outcome-Driven Innovation School of Jobs to be Done. So as product manager for John Deere, for their premium compact tractors, he led strategic marketing for the 1023, well, I don't know what that model is, and the 1025R. I'm not an expert in tractors, but both tractors. And with the foresight provided by Jobs to be Done, these would become two of Deere's most successful products in its long history. And now as the Senior Vice President of the AIM Institute, Scott leads product development, teaches workshops on innovation, and advises corporate leaders and practitioners on growth via jobs to be done principles. He has an MS in management and a BS in electrical engineering. So let's start right in. And I would like to ask you, Scott, how did you actually get into jobs to be done?
Well, that's a great question. So I was at John Deere for a while, and it's funny. I should mention this when we were all Jan, Jonathan, and I we got together just half an hour ago or whatever, just technically make sure everything worked well. And one of the first things we said was, we could almost feel the temptation to start talking about jobs to be done. It's like, yeah, but let's hold off on that till the session. And about 35 seconds later, we were right into the middle of some great dialogue about it. And I think that there's something about, I don't know, there's a like-mindedness to people that really think about, that are not, Jan, I really like what you said about it. We're not content just with the quotes that we've all heard, a customer hires a product to accomplish a job. Because I think when we realize that is when when we have to be a practitioner. It's one thing to read a blog, and it's another thing to actually start working on a project. And you're like, wait a minute, how do I do this? How do I do this? So to answer your question, so when I was with John Deere in the early 2000s, product manager, and one thing that's pretty cool about a company like John Deere is you've got huge teams of engineers. Now that I work with B2B companies, they're always trying to get the most they can out of an engineer or two. But John Deere, we had huge teams. We got electrical, mechanical, software. I mean, you've got all these teams, and if you're a product manager, they're looking to you like, well, what should these new features be? And I'm like, I don't know, but it feels like somebody should have figured out how to do that before I walked in the door. And so I started doing a lot of reading. This won't be a surprising story, but I had already read Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, which has some background, but doesn't really go into jobs there. But then I forget which year it was, but when he had the milkshake marketing article that came out, that described that I presume most folks here have heard of, but essentially he did a consulting assignment for McDonald's and was wanting to, and they ended up, McDonald's wanted to understand what they should add to, a milkshake, and Christensen reframed it as like, well, what job does a milkshake do? Like, whoa, that's pretty heavy. But anyway, so I found that to be it was like I could tell it was important and useful, but I didn't really know what to do with it yet. And I kept reading Christensen. I went real deep. The Innovator's Solution to me is the book where it's finally, he's sort of laying it out. Like almost everything Christensen wrote after that was really just, I don't know, there's a whole lot new after that. It was just more him exploring and understanding, but I still didn't know what to do with it. I still didn't know what these features should be. And then a friend who's getting, Dan Paschke, I should give him credit. He was getting an MBA at Duke, and a colleague there had handed him this book called What Customers Want. And I read that book, and it was like, wow, now I know what to do. Now it just like, but there was a space where the job's thinking, I could see how it was useful, but on the other side, I needed to apply it. And it was a huge space in between. It wasn't even close. But when I read What Customers Want, that changed everything. And I proceeded to read everything I could find that Tony had written, went back through all his HBR articles. And when we were having a little nerd fest before everybody got on the phone, I mentioned I found an older book of his from the late 90s, which he doesn't use the term outcome-driven innovation yet, but you can see an earlier iteration of his thinking. So Jonathan, I don't have any short answers to any of these questions because it's sort of a progression, but the short answer is Christensen, initially, I needed help to understand what customers wanted. And what's the best title for a book ever? But then when I found Tony's book, I just went very deep, and I haven't stopped.
Yep. So, well, thanks. Yeah, I think for a lot of us, the book was kind of a bit of a revelation, and puts us on that path. It was certainly that way for me too. And I had a similar problem actually. What you said about, oh, I would have thought someone would have thought about how to do this. I thought exactly the same thing, and I was surprised that there was no kind of approach to solve these problems. Yeah, what features should I build? Not any that I could find anyway easily.
Well, at that time, there was a method called QFD, quality function for deployment. Maybe some of you run across it. And so in my master's program, we studied that and like, oh, and it was taught as if, wow, this is what people are really putting into practice. They're really using it. And I believed it. And I went and I started trying to do that with engineers. And QFD is great if you're designing something really simple, like a piece of wood. With any complexity, it just, either you've got a very small grid and okay, I can design a car door. But then when you try to apply it to something like a tractor, it blows up on you. And I found it, so I tried to use that in practice. And Tony had written an article, I don't remember the name of it, but the article, but he just really blistered, he just tore QFD apart. And as somebody who was trying to use it, that I was like, okay, that resonated. I'm like, well, I like you even more now.
Yeah. Can I just maybe jump in? I think that's really an interesting part that you're bringing up. There's kind of this gap between, okay, you can read about it and maybe have some idea of the general concept, but that kind of crashes or you get really into a lot of trouble once you start trying to actually apply it. And I think that problem still hasn't gotten away. I don't know. I mean, so I think many, as you mentioned before, they read a blog here and there now. So it's kind of, the topic is much more widespread, and then they sit down and try actually to apply it. And it's so hard. It's so difficult if you just have the general concept of it. So what would you say maybe is kind of, what would you, is for example, what customers want still a go-to book for you, or like?
100%. That's, I mean, in a way, so if you read my book, you might think, well, Scott's sort of gone off and doing some different things. But as I mentioned before everybody got together, I still am, I view myself anyway as an ODI purist. And what's in that book really, I mean, you can take, it's certainly probably the single most complete thing, at least to get somebody started. My book's really, if you're just getting started, my book's probably not the best thing for you to read, because you're gonna have a harder time. It answers questions you haven't thought to ask yet, right? Where what customers want really begins with, hey, job, outcomes, how you rate them, get the basics. What do? We just select a market, we gather all the outcomes, now we prioritize them. So I think that's the best starting point for anybody. And it's 16 years since it's been published, and I don't know that, it's every bit as relevant today as it was then. It's amazing to me, as somebody that has been so immersed in a practitioner for so long, how well it does hold up. How many ideas hold up after. But to your point, Jan, when you really bring your own something to it, it's when you are trying to apply something as a practitioner and you find, well, here's a question that's not answered in it, for example, and then I need to answer it. I need to figure something out. But that was a great thing about working for Stratogen. Brilliant people, brilliant practitioners. Probably the most, well, I don't think there's probably to it, the world supply of excellent, top of the line practitioners. That's where they are. They're at Stratogen. So when you work with those folks, when you eat lunch with them, when you ride planes with them, you learn a lot just by asking. You can ask all the nerdy questions you ever wanted. But what you realize though too is that between jobs to be done practitioners together, you can access a language. You can communicate to each other with the language. Well, what's the job? Who are the job executors? What's the market? You can just have a conversation that you can't have if you're trying to understand a market situation. But amongst jobs done practitioners, you can have a conversation about that, and that you can't have with somebody that doesn't have access to that knowledge. And for any of us on this call who are consultants, and that means we're working with clients that don't have access or don't, it's just not their terminology, you're going to be very familiar with that challenge, because you can do a couple things. You can decide to educate them, like spend some time educating them first, and then let's talk about their market, or you can sort of translate in your mind. There's sort of positives and negatives to each, but what it really does though is on a personal level, it just makes it very enjoyable to talk with people who at one level who have the terminology, sort of understand it, with even at another level a great curiosity about it, and that's just great fun. I forgot what the question was.
That's all right. I would like to move forward into the actual meat of the book, and I would like to ask you. You've got a very interesting title, which one would not suspect has anything to do with jobs to be done if one doesn't read the subtitle. And actually, one understands the title through reading the book. I think after having read the book, it's a very interesting title. Could you tell us a bit more about this idea of the statue, and what does that mean? Statue in the stone?
Yeah, great question. And it makes me think of a couple of things. One is, when I was writing it, like, what's the audience? Well, it's tempting to say, well, I should really make this accessible for a lot of people. That's sort of what in America anyway, there's a whole series of books called, it's like for dummies. So it's like stock investing for dummies, or learning Italian for dummies. So it's just like breaking it down to the simplest thing, so it's accessible by the most people. But I just decided I wasn't interested in that, because I was interested in writing it for myself, to help me better. And you know what? If there's some crazy person out there that it appeals to, then I sort of know we have a lot in common right away, and all the better. So I sort of made that decision that it was going to be what makes sense for me. Okay, and so then from there, the title is the statue in the stone, and so it comes from a story. But first, I have to begin with there's really two ideas that came together. First was something that I had heard Tony say many times, which was, Tony said, the purpose of outcome-driven innovation is to help a customer to accomplish a job perfectly. And I'd be like, wow, that sounds really important. I don't know what to do with it yet, but the purpose of outcome-driven innovation, or what you could call applied jobs to be done, is to help a customer to accomplish a job perfectly. And I mean, it was almost like sort of reading Christensen the first time. It's like I knew this was really important, and it's just one of these. It's almost like a proverb. It's like there was depth to that quote that I just something almost to meditate on. And then I heard this story about, I don't even know if it's true. I don't care if it's true, because it's helpful for an illustration. But it was a story from the Renaissance, and it's probably the most famous art in the world, the statue of David, right there in Florence. And the story goes like this: Michelangelo was unveiling the statue in Florence for the first time, and there's a super interesting story, by the way, how that statue came to be. There were multiple sculptors before Michelangelo. It was supposed to go on top of a building, but when he finished it, it's too big and heavy. It's a very interesting story all by itself. But anyway, they were going to unveil the statue of David, and the Pope, as the story goes, the Pope was seeing this statue for the first time and was just amazed, just was speechless. And he turned to Michelangelo and he said, "Well, how did you create something so perfect?" Now there's that word perfect. So how did you create something so perfect? So you started with this raw stone, this rock, and somehow created something perfect. And what did Tony tell me? Tony said the purpose of outcome-driven innovation is to help a customer to accomplish a job perfectly. There's that word again. But there's sort of a third unstated thing that was also, I heard Tony say a lot. If you and this was, again, just one of the huge blessings of working with him. One of the most educational things you could ever do is to go through a set of outcomes with him and watch how he changes them, how he improves, listen, and he improves outcomes, and listen to why and how he changes them. And it's this: it's better to remove a bad thing than add a good thing. So perfection is about, it's about taking away. It's about removing everything that's bad. It's about removing all the errors, moving everything that goes wrong. And that's, you don't build perfection, you strip away imperfection, and perfection is what's left. And so in one sense, wow, this can sound really crazy, like, you know, what Scott been smoking. But if you look a little deeper, I really think it's the most practical idea in the world. Let's go to but look, none of this matters if we can't apply it. I mean, maybe it's fun. We can get together, we can talk about it, you know, over drinks, but I'm not as interested if we can't apply it. Now, here's how we apply it. When you're ultimately, you're facing a customer and you're going to do a qualitative interview and you want to help them to do something better. What's that? It's their job to be done. So maybe it was because of my immersion in the John Deere world, but when I start to think of examples, I find myself talking about mowing the lawn, beautifying the property. You know, that's just where my biggest immersion into this was. And so if you take a job like, and by the way, even in mow the lawn, us jobs to be done practitioners, we could attack that. Should we have the word mow in there? It's a solution. But anyway, let's put that aside for 1 second. Let's say that it's the job that be done is mow the lawn. And I'm going to Jonathan's house. Jonathan's at a beautiful property, and I'm interviewing him. So I say, Jonathan, tell me what some of the challenges you have when mowing the lawn. What am I looking for? I'm looking for everything that goes wrong, every imperfection, every error, everything that makes it a pain in the butt, that makes it time consuming, that anything that I'm worried I might be injured. Anything that impacts how the yard looks afterwards. I am looking for I'm not looking for things that are going right. I want to know what goes right. Mowing the lawn done perfectly is mowing the lawn absent of all the bad stuff. And so that's maybe the third part of that. So I'm gonna summarize here a little bit. The three bits there. One, the purpose of outcome-driven innovation is to help a customer to accomplish something perfectly. Then the next one is, to make something perfect, you remove everything that's imperfect. That's how you get there. And so that's what makes it not just, crazy music. That's where it's practical. As soon as you're taught. Now, I just give one example of doing a customer interview. I mean, that's just, I think if you're doing this type of work, that's something you're probably going to be familiar with, but it's a mentality, it's a way of thinking. And then that story about Michelangelo, I just thought helped to pull all that together. How did you create something so perfect? I removed, I don't even know if I said this in the story, but Michelangelo replied, he said, I cut away everything that was not David. So to get this perfect statue, you have to remove everything that was perfect. So I titled it that because I wanted to, because I only wrote it for myself. But also I was sort of thinking that if there are any other crazy people, that to me, that was the core idea. That was the core idea. And if there's any other crazy people like myself, then that's the best summary I think I could give, was to refer to that story and hope that people can make some of those connections. Look, it should have been like, whatever, jobs to be done for dummies, or it's not a great title from a marketing perspective. It's only written for me and people who think like me. It's not
yeah, but that's kind of how you find your audience, right? So
yeah,
I actually don't even remember how I discovered your book, but for me, so this exactly what you're kind of what you've explained here, immediately connected with me. I mean, in the first sentence you read in the book, you mentioned that word perfection as well. In this, there is an enormous 21-word sentence I think that everybody should read, and we can maybe dig into that later on. But for me, you kind of found a way of framing the whole concept of jobs to be done, but in a new way. I hadn't heard anybody explain jobs to be done in terms of perfection and imperfection, and that kind of immediately struck me.
Yeah.
And sorry, yeah, go on.
No, I was saying, for me, exactly the same. Yeah, I think you don't give yourself enough credit. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. This idea of.
So from our point of view, because one question is always, what do you say as a response to the question, okay, what is jobs to be done? And you can either go into, right? So you can either go into words like thinking or logic, or you can go into how to, so you can explain how you would actually apply it. But then again, I think that would be, it's not really the right answer to, okay, what is jobs to be done? And I think you found like almost like a meta question of answering this. It's removing those imperfections. And I really like this. If I may, I don't know, Jonathan, if you have a different plan, but just one question to this perfection, imperfection question, because couldn't it also be, what does then removing imperfection mean? Couldn't removing imperfection also mean that you have to add something to a product?
Certainly could. But that's the product, right? So there's another, so as soon as you want to be able, so let's go back to mowing the lawn. Let's say we're talking about mowing the lawn, and then somebody says, yeah, but I also, while mowing the lawn, I want to kill all the weeds. Okay, but guess what? It's another job. It's a different job. Yeah. It's a related job. Now, I just want to, while mowing the lawn, I also want to kill the weeds. So when we've added, we've added another job to it, right? So it's other thing we want to do, now we've just got, it's not bad. And when we develop our product, we can certainly develop a product that addresses more than one job. A tractor, by the way, does that. One of the illustrations that I'll do, by the way, Jan, I don't want to leave that first question you asked. I think it's a good one. It's something we should, everybody, if you think about it enough on this call, it's something we should all think about. When somebody without any background asks, what is jobs to be done? That's a great question. And I think that's worth us exploring here. Wow, I forgot I lost my train of thought.
Well, maybe I can just jump in and say that we have actually some interesting questions from a few people, and I would like to give them the opportunity to ask them. I also just wanted to, but before that, I wanted to just bounce off exactly what you were saying with Jan, is this idea of taking away, of minimizing stuff. You make the point in the book, and that's when I say that your book was good, because it answers your questions. I had a note saying, yeah, but sometimes we also want positive stuff. When I go on a trip, I want to get there on time, but I also want to see a nice countryside or something like this. Or and you address this question, and it's a related job, and I thought that was very nicely structured together. As the objective is that this is also open and people can jump in, and we have Kevin Richard, who had a few questions, and I was wondering, would you be willing to ask your question, or do you prefer that I read it?
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Jonathan. I can ask my question. So, yeah, I'm coming from the design field, and when I heard of the jobs to be done approach, it kind of raised my interest, because this is something that I feel is really close to what we already are trying to do in this field, like understanding the need of the people we are trying to design for. And therefore the question is, my question was, isn't jobs to be done some kind of reinterpretation or rediscovery of this approach of designing for the people? And I can cite a few of approaches that exist for at least 30 years that does exactly what jobs to be done claim to do, and even in the form of the methods and the activities as well, are really close. Yeah, I was wondering what are your thoughts on that, and if you found in the past some kind of similarities in the approach.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's so funny you mentioned that because I'm sort of noodling on an article with something on the theme of, well, how new is jobs be done? Is it really
Mm.
20 years old? Is that really it? Or does it, or where does it begin? Does it begin with, there's a quote from the mid 80s. I mean, where does it begin? And to some extent, there's nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, there's probably been salespeople going back thousands of years, you know, when they were, I don't know, they were selling their flint to somebody to start a fire, you know, instead of, you know, selling the attributes of this is the hardest flint, you know, look how fast, look how quickly this starts a fire, right? And so there's I think you could probably go back as far as you want, because the core idea is separating problems and solutions, right? The core idea, it's back to problem solving. So if you've ever been to a problem solving course, just general problem solving, but step one is not come up with ideas, it's define the problem, which we just happen to use the words job to be done for this problem to be solved. Now there's other little things you can find too. I don't know if any of you are familiar with TRIZ, T-R-I-Z. It's this Russian method of solving problems. But within that is something called functional analysis. Now, TRIZ is not something that is, I think the community of practitioners, it's sort of unfortunate. It seems to be in the decline. I find it to be very interesting, but it seems to be in decline. But anyway, if you go deep into functional analysis, you will find lots of commonalities with job to be done. What that would do is you would look at the function of something. So I've got my coffee cup, right? So what's the function of the handle? What's the function of this? So you can get rid of the hand. So the function of this is to give, you know, a place for a person to hold it. If you get rid of it, you have to replace that function with something else. But anyway, if you go deep into functional analysis, even though it doesn't seem to use much, you'll find so much commonality with jobs to be done. So, and I'm not familiar with a lot of design thinking and some of those types of things, but so then if it's not super new, then why jobs be done? Well, I would say I think, first of all, it doesn't matter if it's the best thing in the whole world that ever existed. It only matters if it's useful. It only matters if you can use it and help your clients and to better and to, you know, figure out which is what problems they want solved, which direction, and to help them to make something better. And that's what's a little ironic about me talking about perfection, because I never say, well, yes, the goal of outcome-driven innovation is help a customer to accomplish a job perfectly. But when we say that, we're referring to an asymptote, right? We're not going to really do it perfectly. What that tells us is the direction of where better is. Better is getting closer to that. And then when we get to product development, we're not going to get to perfect, but it tells us, you know, how to get to better. And by the way, when we get better, all the competition makes new things, and the definition of better changes, right? So I hope I answered the question that was asked, but I get asked sometimes, well, hasn't this been around forever? And yes and no. Very, very similar things like functional analysis, for example. But where I think jobs be done might be better, though, quite frankly, is that it's just very complete in the way you frame up a market. Who's, you know, so I mentioned, what's the job? Mow the lawn. Great. Next question. Who do you want to innovate for? Wow, that's a big question. Is it homeowners? Is it governments? Is it commercial mowers? Oh, great. It's commercial mowers. Okay. And so it just leads you to ask all the questions that you need. And so it has a vocabulary with it. And then certainly if you go into my book, there's one of the reasons I wrote the book is because there was so much, as a practitioner, there were questions that weren't answered for me, things I sort of needed to still work out. And so even maybe something else will be better and have a better definitions and terminology, and that's fine. But it's useful as is, whether it's the best thing or not. Maybe there's something better, we'll learn that. But here's something for sure. nothing is, it's jobs to be done in its current state is a product. It is a solution. It's a solution to what? Well, that'd be an interesting question. What's the job be done of jobs be done? But there will always be a better solution. There will always be improvements. And so we shouldn't look at that as, wow, it's terrible because it's not perfect, right? We don't have that expectation with our clients for their products to be perfect. So jobs be done is not perfect either. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Kevin?
Yes, yes, I guess yes. There's still something that I find interesting that design explores and maybe jobs to be done in some way tries to explore it, but it's going beyond the functionality and also into the relationship with between the people and the thing we are designing for, the thing we are trying to design. Sorry, and this goes a bit beyond just the usefulness or the functional aspect of it. And I don't know how do you see it in the jobs to be done framework, but I don't feel like it's always well explained or formulated.
Are you referring to like emotional jobs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not well used. I don't think like it is well explained, and it's hard to know how to use them, in fact, in jobs to be done.
Yeah, well, emotional jobs are higher level things. Emotional and social jobs, somebody put in the chat, they're higher level, meaning that I mean, anything you want, anything, well, what are they? So they're ways you want to feel or avoid feeling, basically. So by the way, I have to tell this story. So John, I think the way we first interacted was on Twitter. I could be wrong, but you asked a question, which I haven't.
I'll still ask you the question again.
Yeah.
I've written it down.
Well, the question, so I say in there that the ultimate job to be done is for all mankind to be at peace. And John asked me, well, how did you arrive at that? But just by virtue of him asking that question, I knew that Jan and I we were going to have a lot in common just by him asking that question. But anyway, that's a clear emotional job. Be at peace. Yeah. That's the ultimate. So how do we design a product to be at peace? Well, it's definitely something somebody wants to accomplish, but is that the job? Now let's come back to reality. As a company, as we make stuff or whatever, what are we're going to tackle a job many levels below that. If we kept saying, let's go back to mow the lawn. Okay, this is a little exercise I would do with students, or when I teach a VOC class, I'll sort of walk through the thought experiment. If I ask, well, I'll just ask you guys, how would it help me to mow the lawn? What does that help me to do better?
Well, have short grass.
Okay, shorter grass. What does that help me to do better?
It makes the yard look better.
Makes the yard look better. What does that help me to do better?
Impress my neighbors.
Impress my neighbors. What does that help me to do better?
Feel better. Feel better about yourself.
Feel better about myself. What does that help me to do better?
Be at peace.
Be at peace. Whatever. Thank you. But what you can hopefully you can see when you keep going, you start with something very functional. Try it with anything. You will end up with something like that. Now, maybe it's not be at peace, maybe it's be happy. And we could have that conversation. But as you go up, you find yourself at emotional jobs. Ultimately, that's what functional stuff helps us to do, is to address emotional things. Now, let's come back down to practitioners. As a company, like if you're John Deere, what job does it make sense for you to help a customer to get done better? Impress neighbors? Probably you want to help. The level makes sense is to help them to mow their lawn better. And then you don't have to, it ultimately drives all these other things. So, again, this is just my opinion, but I think you can make that connection to emotional jobs if you want, But as a practitioner, at the end of the day, you're going to usually choose something functional. Now, to your point though, Kevin, you do have to make the thing look like something, right? You have to make it, it's going to look like something. It's going to be a certain color. It's going to be either have angles or it's going to be curved. It's going to be all that. I can just tell you as a practitioner, I can tell you as a practitioner how we use jobs to help, at least not to design it, but to give feedback to designers. And so with John Deere, the original process is, hey, draw a bunch of stuff, throw us a bunch of drawings, and we all sit in a room and argue. I like this one. John likes that one. Jonathan likes that one. Kevin likes this one. All right, what do we do? So we did some qualitative work with customers, and we asked them, we basically were exploring what were the positive attributes of a tractor. And, one, for example, was, more like, one was masculine versus feminine. So this is not political statements. This is just what customers said. Okay. But masculine versus feminine, for example. And so they determined that customers, this has nothing to do with whether the customers are male or female. They expected the tractor to be a more masculine looking thing. And so then we had a bunch of scales like that. It's just one I happen to remember. One was functional versus a toy. Looks like a toy, looks functional. And anyway, and so then we took the designs and we had customers to rate them. Does this design, how do you rate this masculine versus feminine, functional versus toy? And that helped to drive some objectivity into it. But at the end of the day, designing is a creative, artistic thing, and you're ultimately going to have to, create something and interpret it. I'm probably getting outside of my area. Well, no doubt about it. The closer I get to design, the more I'm definitely getting outside of my area of expertise, and so I try to stay aware of that. The only thing
I think this is exactly the I don't want to misrepresent your question, Kevin, but I think. This is in the general discussion of, is jobs to be done, not just design. And I would say it's not. And the design is it spans a much greater space than jobs to be done. And I think this is both you could call that a weakness of jobs to be done, or it's the strength. In my view, jobs to be done focuses really on what could be framing, one could call framing the problem. And I think if your question is about how can we then instantiate a solution that resonates with people and makes them feel good and that they look at it and they feel it's beautiful or whatever, I don't think that really is the job of jobs to be done. Jobs to be done really just tries to say, this is what you need to solve. These are the issues. But then it's design's work to kind of design a solution. And of course, design spans both areas, problem and solution. But I think jobs to be done really focuses just on the problem side, would be my my opinion on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree. I agree with, I'm fine with this statement. I agree with and thank you very much for the replies. I would say that then it depends which framework you use the jobs to be done in, because some frameworks are more prescriptive and how you should use the insight than others. So, but I find it really useful framed as you said, Jonathan, for instance, in my use of the jobs to be done in the, we'll say, the design space. But thank you very much. Yeah.
But just one just one example where it might be useful. So jobs, it can be about there's types of jobs about like a door. What's the purpose of a door, right? Or the job of a door. But there's also jobs of learning to use things. And have you ever seen a door that with a handle that it looks like you should pull, but you're supposed to push it?
Yeah.
Well, some designer put that handle on there, right? And so everybody's going up there and they're all, whatever. They're pulling when they should be pushing. So there was a job of, or I could even call it an outcome, minimize the time to know how to operate the door. And that's where design could have performed better on on that.
It's called affordance in design. What you are saying, yeah.
Yeah.
There's,
Right.
I think there's, you should Google it. There are Norman doors. I think I'm not 100% sure, but it's kind of a name. So a door that looks like you should pull it, but you actually have to push it. So I think there is even a name for that issue. Is it right? So okay, yeah. Somebody in chat, I think chat said it's Norman door. Okay, maybe because I think we're a little bit in this discussion also of kind of leaping into the solution space. I mean, in your book, you're kind of also rephrasing jobs to be done in the sense in using the yin and yang, let's say metaphor, or I don't know how you would put it. And maybe you could touch a little bit on this. How did that help you kind of rethink what jobs to be done is and what it is about?
Yeah, good question. And I was hesitant to use yin and yang just because it's been used a lot. You know, the yin and yang of whatever. It's just become popular, but you know, it was just useful. It was a metaphor that fit. So you know, you've got darkness and light, right? But the light contains a bit of the darkness. The darkness contains a bit of the light. Light travels to darkness. It doesn't go the other way. So that, to me, that was useful to think about for a couple of reasons. One is this idea of problems and solutions, or jobs and solutions, right? One of the first things you'll learn when you sort of go down this jobs and done rabbit hole is you've got to keep jobs and solutions separate. Like you got to keep those separate in your mind. And that works for a while. But then you realize that, you know, actually, just as we illustrated, when we laddered up from mowing the lawn to impressing your neighbors to being at peace, it turns out that one is a solution to the other. One job is a solution to another job. Mowing the lawn is a solution. It's a product to impressing your neighbors. So that sort of tears apart this idea that they can truly be 100% distinct, maybe with the exception of that one at the top. And that we probably have an interesting conversation about that. And that's really, really important. If you're working with a client and they make lawn care equipment, you know, and they're going to innovate, you know, are you going to help them to maintain a mower? Is that what you're going to explore, or to mow the lawn? Or is it about beautifying their property? You have to select the job that you're going to help them to get done better. And it's not because a job is a solution to another job, then that tells us these things are not as distinct, separate things as we'd like to think they are. And it really, what's a job or a solution, it really depends on our perspective and the particular client we're working with. You know, what level of job should they be going after? Should John Deere be helping? Should they with it? So we're talking about, well, with all of their initiatives, maybe it is about something higher, but you're not working with the client on all their initiatives. You're working on one particular project. With this initiative, are we helping a customer to mow the lawn better? Are we helping them to beautify their property better? Or are we helping them to impress their neighbors? And so I thought the yin and yang was good because, you know, in Western thought, we have a continuum, like, you know, hot to cold, where this is super cold, this is super hot, and it just sort of gets a little warmer. You know, that's Western thought. But this Eastern thought of the idea of you can have things that are distinct, but they also, one can have part of the other, and the yin and the yang, right? The light goes. If you've anybody studied thermodynamics, you'll know this, or maybe remember this. Like heat travels to cold. Cold does not go to heat. It literally only goes one way. And so problems and solutions solve problems. Problems don't create solutions. So Jan, I really didn't want to use it, but the metaphor just did it so well. And then when I'm thinking, I didn't want to use it because it had been used a lot. But then with a little more reflection, I was like, wow, you've got a way of thinking. It's been around thousands of years. That's probably not a reason to resist it. That's probably a reason to say there's some wisdom in that way of thinking. But as a Western person, that's not, I don't, you know, it wasn't the most natural thing to accept.
I mean, by the way, I would just want to mention two things. On the first, I think this is what I also liked about your book very much, because you kind of embrace that not everything is so clear cut, and you embrace it throughout your book, and you mentioned where things become a little bit grayish, and you're very open about this. And I think that's also something. As soon as you are a practitioner, you have to take certain decisions, and there's gray areas in between, so nothing is that clear cut. And I really like this about the whole book. And I think especially this second question is, I think, as you said, so you kind of can make a hierarchy of jobs, and suddenly you realize one is a solution for the other, and that gets you into whole kinds of troubles if you're trying to explain it. And so I really like, I mean, we have I think there you need a kind of a tool of how do you call this, I think, the target job or the targeted job. So you say, okay, at one point you have to say, okay, this is the job we're going to target. This is where we're going to help our customers to get more perfect, or kind of execute the job more perfectly. And I think it's really a hierarchical structure, and you can build that hierarchy and decide, and then say, okay, what's kind of our scope? What should our perspective be, in a certain sense? If you map those out, and you map it out on different levels, so you can go up and down, or left and right. So.
Yep. Yeah, I understand. By the way, the question you posed earlier on, though, it's one that it's hard to answer, which is, how do you what's a way to explain this to somebody for the first time? I say that as somebody who has done it a lot. But basically sort of, the customer hires a product to get a job done. And there's Christensen's word hires, which is, it's just the best word for that. The customer hires a product. But I don't believe I'm a very good communicator of this to new folks. I think that's something I'm still trying to learn to do better. So it's a great question you pose, and
I would from my perspective, if you're starting with jobs to be done, I would strongly recommend your book, because you clean up a lot of things that get people confused. So
yeah, and also the misconceptions. I mean, jumping off what you were talking about regarding the problem and solution, and the yin and yang. You talk about these misconceptions, which were for me exactly those. When I was reading Ulrich, you kind of think, but isn't this job basically a solution? And you addressed this head on, and I thought that was very nice. And the fact that you also basically say that a job can mention a solution in it. It's a similar thing. In fact, it's just a matter of perspective, and a job can be a solution. And you really spell that out. I thought that was very nice. And actually, generally for me, another thing I really liked about the book is what I couldn't really find a better word, but I would call this kind of you kind of strive for a certain universality. And what I mean by that is that things that seem to be different, you kind of connect them in a way. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. For instance, one thing that's definitely not clear from ODI and any other book I read is this idea that the error statements, or desired outcomes, as we call them in ODI, or the needs, to put it colloquially, are in fact jobs themselves. Similarly to they are jobs. And I thought that was quite a very interesting idea. Everything is kind of connected in this way, that they are jobs. And there's this notion of narrowing also, which I thought was very interesting, that you get to consumption jobs through narrowing with a product, or you get to narrow a job through context. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, was that intentional, this idea of putting everything under the same banner of jobs, and how did you get to that?
I'm sorry, I think I've lost the question. You were talking about, I'm sorry, could you rephrase the question?
So the question is, you say that desired outcomes or error statements, as it is your terminology, are themselves jobs. And this for me is not something I heard before. And I wondered how you got to this and why you believe they are jobs.
Yeah, okay, great. I get this. That's actually amongst, we'll say, jobs to be done practitioners. That's one of the most common questions I get. So I'm glad you brought that up. How can you have something that we'll use the term outcome? That's what most people use. How can that also be a job? The simple answer is it fits the definition. So if we're looking, let's go back to mowing the lawn, right? We're studying a job of mowing the lawn. And, so when you mow the lawn, one of the things it does is, your blades throw the clippings, right? So you could have an outcome that says, well, you want to minimize the number of clumps, like however you would word that, minimize the number of grass clumps. Okay, that's an outcome. But let's back up and look at the definition of a job. Begins with a verb, a goal or objective somebody wants to accomplish. The short answer is your outcome statement meets the definition. It doesn't violate it in any way. And when I realized that, when I saw that it met the definition, I was sort of there. I was like, how can you say it? How can it meet the definition and then it just like you just disqualify it? On what grounds can you disqualify it from being a job? Now it's a very small, it's not a huge, you probably are not going to have a whole project around minimize the frequency of grass clumps. That would be a very narrow project, but it's not about judgments over whether you should study it. The question is it a job or not? And it meets the definition. And so to some degree, an outcome, but it's also true that the word outcome is useful for you because it tells you that you're at a level below what you're studying. That's where it's still useful, right? Because if you're saying, well, that's an outcome, minimize the likelihood of grass clumps, that tells you that there's something higher, and if you reduce the grass clumps, it helps you to do something better. What is that thing? It's mowing the lawn. That answer your question, Jonathan?
Yeah, that's great, and I think it also for me I thought that was interesting, and I'm adding on what you don't talk about this in the book, but the idea of connecting parts to the whole. I think that goes in that direction because you can then talk about the job of an attribute of a product of a feature that connects with one of the outcomes. Now, of course, it's probably quite complicated and you wouldn't always necessarily have a one-to-one relationship, but it goes in that direction. And that was definitely also for me lacking in other expressions of jobs to be done. So, I mean, I don't know if, we had set an hour and a half for the talk. So we've got now another half an hour. So I don't know if people are still, should we open it up? Or, I mean, I had a few more questions. Do people, shall we keep going like this or?
I think just so to everybody, feel free to jump in at any time. And I think we can open it up a little bit more. I just want to get one question, one comment in as well. So, because I think that is really this, so that you, in a certain sense, don't distinguish between an outcome and a job. In a certain sense, you do, but you say it fits the definition. I was kind of surprised by this as well. But again, if I going back to practice, to the practitioner experience, it's kind of made sense to me because, if you're talking to, let's go to a situation where you interview a customer and you talk to them, and that was always something I found interesting is so from the same kinds of questions, you get either an outcome or you can get a job. And that was always kind of an experience. So if you ask them, okay, what do you actually want to achieve? What is the goal behind this? Tell me what is, you can get an outcome or you can get another job. So kind of that's why I immediately thought, okay, there is something to this. Of course, for 10 years, I've always been very strict to keep them apart. But when I read it in there, I think, okay, yeah, that's right. And it kind of, you can spark either a job in an interview from a person, or you can get an outcome from the same kinds of questions. Because what do you want to achieve could be either an outcome or I want to achieve another job.
That's right.
So
yeah, my first clue was that it met the definition. Like if you look at the definition of a job, the outcome met the definition, and I couldn't disqualify it. I couldn't think of any grounds of how you could say you could disqualify it. Yeah.
So maybe we can. Another bit I really liked actually is when you talk about value propositions and positioning, and I think also this you kind of insist on a bit more than in other parts of the literature. Could you tell us about value proposition? I mean, you say value propositions are properties of the product. Could you maybe expand on that for
Well, yeah. So I call it the paradox of value propositions. So what's the paradox? It's that so let's go. I guess it's funny with each talk. I'll pick an arbitrary example and then I just keep using it the whole time. So I'm going to continue to do that. So let's say we have a whole value proposition around where our mower has no grass clumps. Minimizes the grass clumps. So it's the paradox of a value proposition is you can objectively measure that to some degree, right? I mean, I don't know how you would do it, but you could objectively measure that. But so the value proposition is objective, but it's also subjective because it's only measured in somebody else's mind, right? So it only exists in positioning, the same thing. Like the Trout and Reeves book, Positioning, The Battle for the Mind from like 1982, I think. Man, everybody needs to read that book. If you read that, What Customers Want, and Blue Ocean Strategy. You read those three, and maybe I'll throw the Innovator Solution. You read those 4 books, and you've really got something, and you'll see how they link together. But yeah, so it's objective in that, again, so this is everything in this book is really from the perspective of a practitioner. I'm really not claiming these are the laws of the universe. It's like, this is what for me, is useful. And so if I'm designing a new product and the number one outcome, most important, least satisfied, is we got to minimize the amount of clumps, then I can measure that, and I can look at the competitive mowers, and I can objectively say that it has less. But it's also subjective because it's only measured in the in the customer's brain. So that's where so there's a few other places like that. Like we talked about solutions and jobs, and I appreciate you mentioning this, Jan, because I just where there's these paradoxes, I mean, who am I to try to go to some higher level of knowledge and break them apart? It's like, look, it's just, there it is. It's paradox. You objectively improve something, but you accept that it's subjectively measured in the brain. And certainly what you communicate, maybe this is back to Kevin's design question, in the design of it, you want to communicate whatever that is. And certainly in your marketing and positioning and whatever, you also, ultimately reality. So here's where we get into a lot of philosophy on, but reality exists, but it also only exists in the customer's mind. So those are 2 statements that are both true that seem to be in opposition. But it's just, I don't know how to resolve it, and I don't I guess feel any desire to. I'm comfortable letting paradoxes, letting them it's a paradox.
I mean, what would be really lovely now, I have a philosophical background. It would be really lovely to kind of say, okay, we stop, and now we take an hour and a half and talk about philosophy and figure out how subjective and objective relate to each other. And so, okay, but let's not do that.
I'll have to ask you questions because I'm definitely, with a lot of this, I feel like I'm outside of my expertise. This is all for me about just as a practitioner. And so even about that paradox, there's something to just accepting it. All right, as product developers, hey, this is the outcome we're going to improve performance against. And then we need to turn to our marketing communications people. and say, and so then you know you can use that template. That value proposition template, it's in the book. It's nothing earth-shattering or particularly new or interesting about it. It's just a value proposition template. You probably could go to Wikipedia or anywhere and find the exact same one. But you do have this. Your marketing communications has this job of communicating that to the customer's mind and helping to illustrate how your product does that better than the competition.
Yeah.
And I mean, actually, for me, to get into maybe some more as we're getting to the end of the talk, so maybe I think we've not covered everything, but covered quite a lot of the topics you touch upon in the book. I was one comment I would make is, and this is generally for jobs to be done, and I think one thing you don't really address necessarily in the book, and maybe people will disagree with what I'm going to say now, but there's this notion of things can be good or bad in absolute, or we can judge things in absolute. And in my opinion, such a thing doesn't exist. So we're always comparing things to competition. And I think you do mention, for instance, so when, for example, we say that the desired outcomes are properties of the job, that they are job dependent and they're independent of the solution, even without going into the discussion of a job is both a solution and a problem. I think if we're saying, okay, I choose this target job as a problem, I look at the desired outcomes. These, in my opinion, are very, very dependent on the types of solution that exist in the world. And I think if you just consider the perfectus that you invented, this idea of the perfect job, and I really like that in a sense shows this, because the perfectus is what? Is basically just the job is done and there aren't any undesired outcomes, as we always make everything negative. Yeah. So in my sense, error statements, it's just something I would push back a bit on, is that we're always comparing solutions. Maybe we're comparing to a perfectus, but we're always comparing things. And I feel there's not enough of acknowledgement that actually we should be talking about existing solutions. And I would like, for example, in the jobs to be done, to see more of saying, okay, we mow the lawn. Well, what are the solutions? Well, what are the desired outcomes or the error statements for a lawnmower is this. The desired outcomes or error statements for hiring a company are this. And be clear that these error statements are actually very intimately related to solutions. So I wanted to, if you or anyone had an opinion on this.
So they're related to this solution. Do you mean like a person's rating of the performance is related to a solution?
I mean that error statements are not solution independent. They're totally related to the solution we're considering. And it would be beneficial, in my opinion, rather than to just list them all and say, these are the error statements for the job, is to say, these are the error statements for this type of category of product of solution we're using. And one category could be the perfectus.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, at least the way I think about it, if you have outcomes around a job like mow the lawn, you would certainly, your outcomes could refer to the mower, because I even use the word mow. If I use shorten the grass, it sort of sounds like a strange scope. Tell me your challenges when shortening the grass. Then you might not. But but when you have a consumption job, such as maintain a mower, maintain a lawn tractor, maintain a mower, you could certainly have an outcome such as minimize the time to change the blades. Well, the blade's a solution. Can I mention that? Yeah, because it becomes your scoping. You have to think about what your universe has. If your universe has mowers with blades, and that's the area you want to innovate within, then you could certainly say minimize the time to change blades. If you want to think, you get this conversation a lot with practitioners when they're like, well, they're looking at the definitions like, well, this isn't supposed to include a solution. But you're literally defining the language of like the world you're innovating in. And if I'm developing a new lawnmower and it's going to come out in 5 or 6 years, I'm gonna make an assumption that does it have blades or not. Now, I do think it's worth discussion. It's not good or bad to include the blade but I think it should be thought about. I think it should be, can we mention this blade or not? Future solutions might cut grass with lasers. But you know what, 5 or 6 years, I think we're good mentioning blades. So you can certainly mention a solution as long as you do it intentionally. The other thing is certainly though, different solutions will have different performance levels for certain things. So if we think about security, like for our bank or whatever. So we want, we put in a password, and now we might have face identification or whatever. So what's our satisfaction level with minimizing the time to access our financial data? Well, with the facial recognition, time went down. That solution outperforms the putting in a password. So I may not even be answering your question, Jonathan, but you can definitely mention a solution and outcome if you've done it intentionally.
Yeah.
And for sure, different solutions and different solution forms will have different performance levels against an outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And as you actually make that point, and I would say many people who come into Jobs to be Done will, ask that question relating to, oh, this is not a problem, it's a solution. But I'm not saying exactly this, I believe. When you say mow the lawn, as you explained, you're mentioning a solution implicitly in that statement. And that's fine, as you explain in the book, and I totally agree, it's fine as long as it's clear that we're mowing the lawn. That implies we're using a lawnmower to do so. And therefore, definitely you can mention blades. I have no problem with that. But what I suspect is that if, for example, we took the job of maintain my grass at a reasonable level, well, you would probably see the blades appearing in that too. And I think if you are in a product agnostic, if you have a product agnostic job description, I think it would be worthwhile to actually list the different existing solutions and look at error statements for these existing solutions. And I've not seen anyone really talk about this. We just say, well, so I don't know if I was clear, but so I'm not disputing the fact that if you say mow the lawn, that you can talk about blades. But I'm saying that if for a non product mentioning job, you should define what existing solutions and define error statements relating to existing solutions. There's no other way of doing it when you think about it, in my opinion.
Can I maybe I'm trying maybe to in a sense remedy this. So I think that I think that ties back to what Scott has said earlier. I think what you have to also always have in mind is who is actually the job executor. Like who are the people that we're talking about here, because it's people that have a certain job that they want to get done. And then I think it's really, I mean, Jobs to be Done means taking a certain you take a certain perspective. You say who is the jobs executor I want to look at, and what's the job I want to look at that they want to get done. And I think you will always get into confusion if you don't do this. If you try just in an abstract way, without really the goal in mind of, for example, trying to improve a product or innovate the next generation of a product or whatever, without this perspective, you will never find an abstract job that is just there and true for everybody. it's a certain way of taking a perspective on a product or on a market or even defining a market. So I think if you're at, so in a certain sense, I think, Jonathan, you're coming from a different kind of way, but in the moment you're talking, I mean, to John Deere, and you're in that company and in that context, you're looking outwards with jobs to be done perspective, and that kind of question probably never really comes up. So you see what I'm trying to say? I think if you fix who is the job executor and what's the focus job, what's the target job that we want to look at, then I think you never run into that problem of, is that really the job that we should be looking at?
I mean, yeah, for John, I'm not convinced that the job executor solves that particular problem. I can give an example that I was working on where, for instance, so the idea was to give it was a training camp, and so we analyzed this training camp, and I tried to do a totally what one shouldn't do, meaning just quickly invent the jobs to be done and error statements without talking to any customers. So I recognize it's totally not the right approach. But I did it anyway, just for getting clarity. And the idea was to learn a topic, and there were quite different ways you could do this. So you could do this online with a course. You could go to a 1-week training camp. You could go and do a university study, go and study at university. You could, I mean, there were at least 4 different ways you could learn this. Do a project to learn how to learn about whatever the topic was. And in that situation, it seemed to me that each of these solutions had totally different error statements and also had their own advantages, definitely. But I felt it was very difficult to just bunch everything together and say, well, okay, this one, because, okay, I have no more, minimize the likelihood of losing my internet connection during a course, for example, I mean, just doesn't apply to university or to doing a training camp in person. So, I mean, yeah, of course, for tractors at John Deere, I mean, in some situations, it's pretty clear, but in other cases, not so clear, it seems to me. And
yeah, I think you have to define your universe. So like with I use example of, does a blade exist or not? I think you have to think about it. For the outcomes for taking an e-course or even for participating in a web conference, you're probably going to have outcomes around, internet access and people being on mute and stuff. But if you just had outcomes around just learn a skill, like why are you taking the course? To learn a skill. You have things like minimize the time to learn a skill, minimize the likelihood of forgetting it. They would really be, if you define the purity around learning a skill, solution independent, you could totally do that. Or you could have more, or you can define a solution that, well, if you define the e-course, basically your project is now, you're studying consumption jobs for taking an e-course. And so for the job of taking an e-course, you're going to have, minimize the time to get online. You're going to have everything about your experience for taking that e-course, which is a solution to learn a skill. So these jobs are at different levels.
Yeah, I think it ties together with you have to make a decision. What do we want to help what's the focus of this whole thing that we're going to do? What's the job that we want this jobs to be done study get done, right? So you have to define that first, and that then really defines where your level.
I'll give you a real example. There was an agriculture project, and there's lots of outcomes around, minimize the time for a plant or seed to germinate, for example. And for the scoping of the project, it was like, well, it's all about growing seeds in soil, but you could also grow them hydroponically. Should we call out the growing in soil? And I'm like, no, we just define it as in soil, but if you're talking to a farmer, you don't have to explain to them we're talking about the dirt out there when he's surrounded by whatever hectares. So, but what you definitely is worth doing is thinking through it. What solutions can we mention? Or what are we going to assume? Does the internet exist in this world? But if you're just studying the job of learn a skill, you know, I wouldn't anticipate having something on there about minimize the likelihood of internet problems. Yeah. But if it's learn a skill via the internet or via e-course, you totally would. So as soon as you define the solution in your job statement, which again is why we can't say jobs are completely solution independent. So we've defined it. Jonathan, you brought it up about a narrower context. When we say learn a course with e-learning or whatever, you've just defined a context.
Yeah, and I really like that actually in the book when you talk about this this narrowing. There's another question, a few more questions, I think. Is Kevin again? You want to jump in, Kevin?
I think there's other questions than from other people than me. I don't know if
there was one by Evan, but unfortunately he left us already. So
okay. Yeah. So okay. So
oh yeah.
Yeah, I had something about interpretation bias, and I feel it's something that is somehow prevalent in the jobs to be done literature, is that we assume that as soon as we can, by thinking through it, come to an abstraction of the idea of what the user tries to do on the designer or product manager side, then we try to fit the reality to this understanding, and therefore we already frame whatever we are trying to do from that understanding. And I feel it's kind of something that is never really talked about in the approach, and I feel really uncomfortable with this because it's an inside out type of approach where we have already expectation on what people are really trying to do. And this is where I will say the difference between the practicality of doing it and the philosophy of the discussion, which is interesting, comes in, is that it's not just about having a good definition of it, it's also coming from it through epistemology and not from ontology, where we already predefined what we want to see and then try to see how it fits to the world. I don't know if my question is clear or my statement is clear, but I don't know if
I think so. Yeah, first of all, we should really, now, ideally, we should go to the customer. Why did you purchase this mower? What did you buy this mower to help you get done better? And they're not going to say, I'm not sure why I bought this. I just walked into the store and I just felt like buying a mower. No, they're gonna know why they bought the mower. So we should get that from them. Now, having said that, if you're in a certain business, you probably, it's probably not a huge risk to say, I think people bought this mower because they want to mow the lawn. But certainly it's always worthwhile to ask your customers, why did you purchase this? Why did you take this? Why did you buy this supplement? You're buying vitamin D. Why did you buy vitamin D? Well, I'm worried about COVID-19, and it's my understanding this will keep me from getting severe COVID. There's the product is vitamin D. They absolutely, and that's one of the things. And look, I'm just piggybacking on what Tony said, but there's this long thought the customers don't know what their needs are. Well, neither Tony nor I believe that we're just walking around with these things that we really intensely want, that we just are completely oblivious to. We may be wrong, but we're wrong together. We have the same position. Put it that way.
I jumped
at that point.
Yeah, I skipped that in my questions because I had a lot of questions, but I really like this also, this emphasis on the fact that the customer is rational. I think you really drove that point in the book.
That's probably the most controversial thing I have in there. It's much more normal, typical to call people irrational, but it turns on the word rational. Like, is it, people will say somebody that's smoking, well, that's an irrational decision. It's very irrational because that's bad for their health. The person saying that is applying their judgment onto the other person, which I'm like, it doesn't matter. The only person's logic that matters is the customer and what they are actually going to do. And they bought that cigarette for a reason. And the cigarette helped with that, whether it's reduce anxiety, reduce their appetite, or something higher, make them feel cool, like the old Marlboro commercials. Right?
Isn't it the differences between rationality and logic? Is that we can come to wrong conclusion with logic? It's with a good logic.
That sounds like a philosophical question for Jan.
I would.
No, I mean,
I'm defying rationality as people are making decisions based on the incentives. They know they're intentionally pursuing something, and they are making a decision consistent with their internal values and beliefs. And if there's anything I have in the whole book that really is counter and sort of has me out there on an island, it's that. It's that idea. But it's really based on, I mean, so it's more rational to save money than to go gamble a lot. But if I go gamble, I got something. If I go eat a dozen donuts right there now, who's going to tell me that's irrational? It gave me some benefit. Is even if it was short term. But anyway, that's probably the most controversial idea in there.
But isn't there an issue in believing that people will speak out because asking people for a reason is asking them to, make a reason for what they done, and they make a judgment regarding the context they are in at the moment you are asking the question, but that doesn't mean this was the context in which they were at the moment they took the decision. So don't you see a kind of a difference between the two aspects of?
Well, there's two things. There's like, do they know it, and do they want to tell you, and how comfortable are they saying it? That's completely different. Like, so it might be, why did you eat the donuts? They might not want to defend that comment, or you might have to be a pretty good moderator to get that information out of them. But they walked over, they bought donuts. It was not there was a motivator to do that. I'm separating the difficulty in getting that information from them, right? That's completely separate. That's moderation skills, being able to have a good conversation with customers. To your point, Kevin, it could be very context dependent, right? Mm-hmm. It's New Year's Eve. I don't drink, but hey, New Year's Eve, I'm gonna. But in that case, my values have sort of changed based on the context. Mm-hmm. But my contention is that a person on the outside can't apply their values to somebody, because what are we doing? Again, this is only about product development, and I want to know. I don't know what. I don't care. I'm not as interested in what decisions a customer should make. I'm interested in what decisions they are going to make. Yeah, I think the ones they're really going to do. And I'm not saying it's easy to get that information, or maybe you have one-on-one conversations or instead of focus groups. But the difficulty of getting the information, I don't even speak to it really. I mean, I get in a little bit into qualitative interviewing, but that's something that's also different. Most books, innovation books, spend a lot more time on step 1, step 2, step 3. And I feel like I'm not as interested in that. I feel like that's more straightforward. I just literally have just a small bit on execution. Everything else is sort of it's on the stuff I'm interested in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I think Jacek, if you want to jump in, then please do. I think Kevin, if you're interested, really, I think there is a lot I think there really the notion of a job can really help. And Christensen uses this expression where he says a job is causal. That causes a certain kind of behavior from the customer point of view. And I think if you want to get into the depths of reason and irrationality and so on, there's a lot of great writing, and I can point you later on towards this, where they make the distinction between what's a reason and what's a cause. And can reasons be causes? So from a philosophical point of view, that will be your go-to discussion. And a job is something that causes you to do. So for example, getting the donuts, that might be, in a certain sense, you can say that's irrational because there are a lot of arguments against it and so on. But there is a rationale in the sense that there is something that causes me to do this, and that's the job. That's the job I want them to get that they do for me. And that, I think, is the way you said this, Scott, where you say it turns on rational. What are we feeling rational with? And if we say, okay, we have a cause or a benefit that we want to get, or however you want to call it, or a job that we want to achieve, then we are completely, then the rationality and the irrationality doesn't have anything to do with, can I defend it? Do I have good reasons for them?
Right.
Is there evidence for it? Is it scientific? Well, all these questions have to do with a different notion of rationality, I think, than the one we're dealing with here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if we put the word job aside for a second and say benefit, I think it's a little more, I think the point you and I are making is a little more obvious. Is somebody getting a benefit from smoking a cigarette? Do they know? Yeah, 100%.
I used to be a smoker, definitely.
Yeah. Are they getting a benefit? So, well, if you look at most of the irrational literature about irrational, it's usually like, well, if you were rational, you'd save half your income when you were throughout your 20s. Well, with your value system, but everybody doesn't have. But again, this is not the law. I don't have the way, this book is not on everything about how the universe works, right? It's just practical. And again, it was just for me on how to, because if you don't begin with the premise that customers know what the errors are and what they're trying to get done, then that's sort of I say it's controversial part of the book, but it's not a controversial part of jobs to be done thinking. That's some of Tony's biggest initial things that he would say is, customers know what their needs are. So that I'm the only thing that controversial. I use the word rationality. That's just maybe I'm not defining it the way other people do, but the fact that customers know what they want has been a core part of jobs to be done. I don't know, 16 years or more.
Yeah. I mean, who else should know? But okay, that's different. Yeah.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that people don't know. I'm just saying that because we ask the question, we frame the answer, and depending on how we ask a question, it's really important. And the fact that we don't want to clarify the context in which they were at the point they took the decision to do whatever they did. And then then we can find a reason for that. Okay, we can find a causal link between whatever context and whatever incentives and therefore whatever behavior. We cannot make this link if we don't know the context. And this is how we ask the question, which is important. And I don't feel like GTVT literature and that matter is especially good at explaining how you get there. It's sometimes
I didn't go into that in deep depth. I'm just not as interested in it. I mean, there's other books on qualitative interviewing that are more about that. But a brief answer, once you begin with the job, mow the lawn, your question is various flavors of what challenges do you have when mowing the lawn? And that's it. No other, you don't need anything. What problems do you have when mowing the lawn? And because a good interviewer will ask short questions and invite long answers. And if you're beginning with your presumption, the only thing you've done to influence the conversation is by suggesting the job. But I mean, you're not going to say, what problems do you have with any part of your life? That's sort of, then you're going after the problem of happiness and bliss. Not smart. So the only thing we've done to narrow the conversation is mow the lawn. What problems do you have with mowing the lawn? Now, from there, Tony's given some great probes. What makes mowing the lawn slow? When does mowing the lawn go off track? When does so you've got some probes you can do, but it's all around mowing the lawn. And so there's definite moderation skills, but the job to be done keeps you out of a lot of trouble. You don't have to create a whole list of these amazing questions. You begin with the job and you just ask, different variations of what problems do you have when mowing the lawn? And if you have a job executor who mows the lawn, they'll have a huge list for you. Now, if you want to talk about a specific context, what problems do you have, mowing the lawn for your vacation home, or I don't know how you would narrow that, but you could certainly do that. But you do your narrowing with the job statement, and from there, the customer, you give them freedom to explore anywhere they want to go, and you just have some additional probes, really, just sort of like if they get quiet. But again, that's back to moderation skills, and I really there's other books on qualitative interviewing. I touch on it. I hit the highlights, but this is not really what my book was for. Is to go depth into qualitative interviewing.
I mean,
sorry,
go ahead.
No, I've talked enough.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there was one other bit that I feel just generally also is always kind of evaded, just generally in jobs to be done, is how do you actually figure out what the job is, and you touch upon it a bit at the end and talk about, let me just find what the terminology, the exploratory research to learn the unknown unknowns, which I like, coming from complexity thinking, unknown unknowns. But I think that is, once you've got the mowing the lawn, finding the error statements, I think, has a very clearly defined process. And I think everyone kind of understands how that works. But one core difficulty is figuring out, mowing the lawn, that's the job. Of course, for mowing the lawn, that's an easy example. But I mean, more often than not, when you're dealing with companies, it's really difficult to find this job. And I think, what we discussed in this discussion regarding creating a hierarchy, so you have an overall understanding, and you can actually consciously pinpoint what job you're going to. That's one approach that can definitely help. But I think, for instance, we didn't really talk about that too much, but I really like that in the book also when you mentioned the narrowing, this idea of adding context and you narrow the job. But you can narrow jobs in an infinite number of ways. I mean, so, I could say, okay, mowing the lawn, but I'm handicapped, for example, or something.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
That's a pretty easy one. But if I say, okay, mowing the lawn when I don't have much time, for example, or mowing the lawn when it's really raining all the time and the grass is always wet, that's another context. And there is kind of a chicken and egg issue of okay, you frame the job and ask the challenges, but that first stage, framing the job, is often very, very difficult to do, and especially if you add the additional degree of freedom of adding context.
I 100% agree. I think just before this call, I was doing an exercise just like that with a client. I do them probably 1 or 2 a week, and it's not easy. It's not easy if you have access to this terminology. It's even more difficult if you don't have access to it, and you're in a company, like you already have so many preconceived ideas about what you should be doing, and they're a little suspicious about the language. I'm definitely that. If there's anything I'm looking to be able to add some skills to be able to do better and to help facilitate a conversation with folks to arrive at the right one. Because a lot of times, this might sound bad, but when I'm working with them, I feel like I know what it should be, and they're completely doing something. And part of the reason they want to do something else, if they have not done a lot of, they've not gathered a lot of insight in a long, long time. They're sort of starving, and so they're like, I want to study this. I want to study this. I want to study this, and then they might ladder up, and they'll pick this global job over all of them. I want to study this, and I'm like, man, you didn't make this a smaller project by now you're studying world peace. You didn't make it smaller just because you were able to come to a single statement. And so, and I might be wrong in trying to direct them, but I'm often trying to get them to go down, select something tangible that like whatever business they're in, they've got some ability to do so. You study this high level, you can do the whole study, and you guess what? Your company won't be able to do anything about it because you've gone beyond your capabilities.
But I think even in the lower levels, you get into this infinity problem in a way, because it's not the it's not one job that's so vast that you can't really like be at peace or something, and you run into all sorts of problems with that. But just the breadth of context you can have if you narrow through defining context, you also end up with kind of another kind of infinity there at the bottom. And how do you actually identify what's the job statement you want, even by going in lower levels? I don't find it's always so obvious.
Yeah, it's not easy. The one thing for the most part, unless your project is real specific, like mowing the lawn with disabilities, unless it really is that, you usually want to avoid listing them, because well, if you narrow it, you just need to narrow it intentionally, but don't accidentally narrow it. Mow the lawn with a laser mower or something, or a robot mower. Don't do it accidentally. But you're right, Jonathan. It's probably the hardest thing. The hardest things I have to do with clients are that, and then help them to be able to write better outcome statements.
Yeah, but I think a lot of this has to do. I mean, you acknowledge this very early on in the book, where you say it's a model. We're building a model, and we want the model. Why are we doing this? Because we also have a certain purpose, and we're building the model to fulfill a certain purpose. And yes, you can get lost, but then you kind of didn't frame it right. So in the beginning, if you frame what you want the model to do for you, and if you have a correct frame, and I'm the exact same way. So very often it depends a little bit on who you're talking to and the client side, but a lot of us have a tendency to get more and more abstract. And I think the richness really, think of error statements. The richness really comes in the more and more concrete that you actually get with a customer, because customers are not abstract. Customers are extremely concrete things, and human beings are extremely concrete. You don't talk, you rarely talk about being at peace.
Yeah.
I mean, you do, but it's a very limited amount. You talk about the damn lawnmower won't turn on, or the grass is wet. So it's very concrete, and I think that is always something to keep in mind. So we're building a model. We wanted to get something done for us, and it's in the concreteness, I think, where the richness really lies.
Agree, 100% agree. Yeah. The thing I would leave everybody with is, if you do read the book, what you'll notice is look, I think I'm more of a curator than anything. I mentioned this when we were on the phone before the meeting. I mean, almost everything in there. I probably have a contribution here and there, but really, I've just found just people that have really been so helpful to me. None more than Tony Owick, and I've just pulled their ideas together and sort of processed them. But they're from them. And when people ask, if I can only give one book recommendation, it's What Customers Want by Tony from 2005. If that doesn't grab you, you're probably not going to be interested in Jobs to Be Done. But I'll bet everybody on this call, if you've been here for a couple hours, you'll probably, I call it the book. And the other thing is, all the writings between Tony and Lance Betancourt, their Harvard Business Review articles, the 2000, and I think it was 6 one, the Customer-Centered Innovation Map, which is how to do job maps. I would highly recommend Tony and Lance's Harvard Business Review articles.
Well, I will respectfully disagree and say that they should start with your book, because I actually found it much more insightful in terms of connecting everything together. And I thought it was a great book, and you can't do it, so I'll do it. I'll make that comment and say everyone should read your book, because it's definitely really good. So
well, it's very kind of you to say. Great questions by everybody. Certainly, I don't claim to have discovered the law of everything. I just wanted it to be something useful for myself, and I kind of, on the outside, I hoped, well, maybe there'll be some other crazy people like me I might meet along the way, and it's been good for that. No better example than this conversation today.
Well, cool. I guess that's maybe a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Scott, for giving us your time, and everyone for coming along and staying so long. I mean, we've had a nice long discussion, so really thank you everyone for being here. And yeah, hope we can speak soon.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much, Scott. It was awesome.
Yeah,
And really also strong recommendation of the book.
it was fun. It was fun. All right.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.
All right,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.